And now I'm pleased to introduce Robert Jay Lifton, here to discuss his memoir, Witness to an Extreme Century. Robert Jay Lifton is an acclaimed psychiatrist and the author of many previous books, including the influential National Book Award-winning Death in Life, Survivors of Hiroshima, and Home from the War, Learning from Vietnam Veterans, as well as The Nazi Doctors. He is a lecturer in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and distinguished professor emeritus of psychiatry and psychology at the City University of New York. As a pioneer in the field of psychohistory, Lifton's encounters with the darkest chapters of the human experience have led him to become a passionate social activist, lending a powerful voice to those affected by the atrocities of war and the dangers of nuclear weapons. Tonight, Professor Lifton describes his latest book, a memoir of his professional life. Witness to an Extreme Century is described by the Boston Globe as a fascinating backstage account of his fieldwork in human depravity and of intellectual life in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. Please join me in welcoming Robert Jay Lifton.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm happy to be here at Harvard Bookstore, which has been my bookstore during my last decade in Cambridge, but also because I realize that this book, which is the story of my intellectual life and public life, and is very much grounded in many ways in Boston. It's not only about work I've done and experiences I've had, it has much to do with mentorship I've attained, and my two primary mentors have been powerful and interesting Cambridge figures, namely David Reisman and Eric Erikson. And these mentors reflected a certain Cambridge ambiance that may have changed, may have been distorted, is never entirely lost. It's a very special thing to write a memoir. It's one thing to write books about other people. In a memoir, one is writing about oneself. And one question that comes up sometimes is, well, who is speaking? Is it the man now, or is it that young, brash character he may be writing about? And the answer is it's a kind of two-headed hydra, but it better be the same head, in which one looks back, I look back at the person I was through the eyes of my present sensibility, and talk about that evolution. But it also is an attempt, certainly in this memoir, not only to describe my own adventures, but also the social and historical climate, what was going on in the world at that time. And it's a strong effort on my part to combine the two and blend the two, because that's how I experience my work in relation to the world. It has a constant, call it dialectic, of scholarship and activism. It runs all through the book. Yes, I'm much concerned with scholarship. That, it must be said, is my major endeavor. Different forms of psychological scholarship, psychohistorical scholarship as we call it, but also concerned with activism. And often they're considered to be antithetical, the one an enemy of the other. I would argue the opposite, that activism deepens and gives purpose to scholarship, and scholarship gives some sort of intellectual quality to activism. Anyhow, that doesn't mean that one is always balanced and clear in what one is doing, but in my view, it means that the one supports the other. You know, we're just following the 4th of July, and many of you probably saw the incredible Boston fireworks. I saw them for the first time because I'm usually on the Cape at this time of the year, but this year is different. And in any case, I thought about watching them from a friend's rooftop apartment. I thought about how I feel about celebrating my country. You know, all through my work, and certainly in this book, there's a steady drumbeat of criticism that I feel very strongly toward the United States. And yet underneath that, and I hope this comes through in the book, is a real love of this country and demand, intense demand, that it live up to some of its better angels. And this kind of book, it's a very American book in a way, and it is a reflection of a very privileged life that many of us have been able to live in this country, given what it offers us. On the other hand, one has to say that our country has been a dangerous force in the world, and this has to be located and confronted, and that's at the heart of my endeavor all through this work. Let me say something about the structure of the book and how it develops and how it developed in me. Any writer will tell you that you can't really write anything sensible until you have some sense of the structure of a book in your mind. The structure is inseparable from narrative. Narrative itself is an issue because we never experience the relative order of the kind of narrative we prepare when we write a memoir. And yet, in pulling together that narrative to write the memoir, we are articulating some sequence and structure and meaning in that life, perhaps learning a great deal about it. I think that was my experience. The structure I came to would seem completely obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me. It was one reason why I hadn't embarked on a memoir for quite a while, even though the thought had occurred to me and various people had suggested it to me. And I came to what I realized was such an obvious structure of grounding the book in my four main research studies: that of Chinese thought reform, that of Hiroshima survivors, that of veterans and especially anti-war veterans, and that of Nazi doctors. It was a very obvious idea once I came to it, but it hadn't occurred to me, as is the situation with most obvious ideas. The first section on thought reform was crucial to me because in embarking on that study and making a key decision in my life to remain in Hong Kong, when doing so felt like a transgression and violating the ordinary conventional sequence of what a psychiatrist and practicing psychoanalyst was supposed to do, namely stay at home in his office or clinic and do a little teaching and not make any trouble in the world. But I was attracted to a subject that I had come upon almost by chance, and had difficulty making the decision, lots of conflict. But once I did make that decision, and my wife was an extraordinary help in that process, once I did make that decision, I was embarked really on a life journey that had to do with a psychiatrist in the world. And that meant all kinds of improvising. There wasn't a clear model for it, though I did learn from mentors, as I've suggested to you. Chinese thought reform, without saying too much about it, was crucial in other ways too. It raised issues about change, about the human mind and its vulnerability to pressure, and that was at the heart of my profession. But it also created a tableau, an amazing historical tableau of literally millions, and one might say hundreds of millions, of people undergoing a systematic psychological process in which they were pressured, sometimes with physical pressure and torture, but that was more unusual in prisons, and mostly through exhortation and threat and psychological pressure toward change. And it had various characteristics that I tried to articulate, but it was an amazing scene to witness and to enter and try to write about. It also created in me what I call an allergy to totalism, all or none absolute views, which claims perfect knowledge in the world and perfect moral claim as well. And this kind of totalism became a kind of bête noire for me all through my life, and in all subsequent studies, and in so much of the world, this kind of absolutism is perhaps the most dangerous mindset that we face. And thought reform taught me a lot about that kind of process. The second study that I did in Hiroshima was also extremely important to me, in this case, in my evolving worldview. There's something so powerful about witnessing the atomic bomb through the bodies and minds of those exposed to it that creates what I call an indelible image, not to be forgotten. And that extends to nuclear weapons in general, which have been a source of my most passionate opposition, particularly in the physicians' movement, but in various peace and anti-nuclear endeavors. But Hiroshima was the basis for that. I describe one memorable set of interviews with a man who was a history professor, and he was on the outskirts of Hiroshima when the bomb fell, and what he said to me in describing what he experienced was something like this. He said, I saw many strange things that day, and they were overwhelming, but what stays in my mind is I looked out and saw that Hiroshima had disappeared. I climbed just a little hill, looked into the city. Hiroshima was no more. Here was a city wiped out by a bomb, and that became a theme in my talks and writings. One plane, one bomb, one city. And it isn't just the Japanese people or the people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki who suffered grievously. It's something, of course, that threatens all of us. But in confronting the Hiroshima work and then in transforming it into anti-nuclear activism, there was always the necessity, and I still feel this very strongly, of not just frightening people about the dangers of nuclear weapons, but offering hope about what could be done in getting rid of them, bringing the human mind, that wonderful instrument we have, to bear on controlling them. The third study I did of anti-war veterans of Vietnam War also taught me a great deal, and I had through that study my lesson in war making in general, which became all too important in subsequent American war making, but also a concept of what I came to call the atrocity-producing situation, a situation that was created in Vietnam and subsequently too in our later wars, in which an ordinary soldier, no better or worse than you or me, could move into an environment and be capable of committing atrocities. And that was so because of military policies like free fire zones and body counts, and also the acute grief, the psychological state that men felt when their buddies were killed and they couldn't identify the enemy in this counterinsurgency war. And that phrase, the atrocity-producing situation, is perhaps the most important idea of my work on the Vietnam War. But I also came to think of the Vietnam War as saying a great deal about war making in general, and I'm constantly reminded of my good friend Howard Zinn, who many of you know or know of in this area, and his remarkable personal history of having been a bombardier in World War II and having discovered a town, his last days in the military, which they bombed, a French town, for no reason, as he studied it later on. And he taught a powerful lesson in the capacity of wars to create, the capacity even in good wars to create atrocity. World War II being a good war in the sense that people believed in it and that there was a real evil that had to be defeated.